Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we have part 4 of the story with the headline, Indian War History. The subheadline says, Reminiscences of Old Strike the Ree, Old Dakota, and their contemporaries in the early part of the present century. This article was written by Creep Easy of Calamity Farm. It says, after parting with his comrades, Strike the Ree's course lay along the banks of the Missouri in the direction of the Arickaree village. As he cautiously continued on his way, his mind was given up to those dark schemes of vengeance and death which had instigated him to undertake this perilous journey. The dreary howling of the wolves from the surrounding plains, the distant bellowing of the buffaloes, the roaring and rushing of the mighty wilderness of waters in the valley below, the vague sounds from the surrounding wilderness as the first gray of dawn illuminated the eastern horizon, all combined to render the effect pleasingly solemn, mysterious, and sublime. But he heeded them not. His great absorbing thought and wish, come what might, was that he might be enabled to wreak his vengeance on the slayer of his brother ere he returned to his native home. He reasoned that the enemy had long since received information from the Arickaree war chief of their passage down the river in the bull boat, and he rightly conjectured that ere this war parties were moving down the river to try and intercept them. His aim was to wreak his vengeance on forebears or some one of his followers and rejoin his comrades who had agreed to take the wounded Indian, Crazy Bull, down the river and await his coming at the mouth of the Cheyenne. He continued on his way until the morning light rendered it unsafe to travel. Then, taking all those precautions which the deep cunning of his wily foes rendered necessary, lest he might be fatally exposed and his hopes of vengeance frustrated, he secreted himself in a dark and gloomy glen, situated near the source of one of those many deep and sloping ravines that wind their serpentine course from the high prairies to the bottomlands below. Bringing forth some pemmican, he ate heartily of it, filled his tomahawk pipe with kinnikinnick, the carefully prepared inner bark of the red osier willow, and lighting it with flint and steel, he smoked while his mind was given up to dark schemes of strategy and vengeance. His passionate excitement resembled a maniac. In vain did rocks and precipices and spring torrents oppose his progress. Let but a single track of his hated enemies meet his eye, and he forgets all dangers and defies all difficulties. Being weary from loss of sleep and continued exertion during the excitement of the last 36 hours, young Strike the Ree wrapped himself up in his blanket, laid down on some dry grass he had gathered together, and was soon sleeping soundly beneath the clear canopy of an overhanging sky. He slept until the sun had long since passed the meridian line, when a distant rumbling, as of a vast army of motion, roused him from his slumbers. Jumping up, he quickly prepared for action. Peering cautiously in the direction of the sounds, he soon discovered the cause of the commotion. He beheld a vast herd of buffaloes, led by a bull of enormous size, coming in on one of the great buffalo trails that make their way from the feeding grounds of the adjacent country to the Missouri River. It was a grand spectacle to witness, this countless throng making their way to the water's edge and plunging in, swimming, blowing, splashing, and bellowing for the opposite shore. Sometimes they would pass over in such a dense and continuous calm as to temporarily form a dam across a portion of the stream, causing the water to rise and rush over their backs as they went floundering and bellowing across the mighty wilderness of waters. Strike the Ree was an experienced hunter. He knew that this great herd of countless thousands would not cross the river during the high stage of water so early in the spring unless closely pressed by a large band of hunters. Scarcely had the van of this great herd of migratory animals passed down through an opposite canyon to the margin of the stream when the cloud of dust that hung like a pall over the moving mass swept on as if hurried along by a blast, revealing a band of wild horsemen that came dashing past in the direction of the river. They rode rapidly down through the bluffs in the rear of the herd to the bottomlands below, and commenced an indiscriminate slaughter of the frightened and infuriated animals as they pressed down to the water's edge. Strike the Ree watched this band of hostile foes as they careened over the plain below with deep interest. They were painted and decked out with all kinds of wild trappings and fantastic embellishments. These bright colors, flaunting and glittering in the sunshine as they moved along on horseback with many wild and dexterous evolutions, gave them an imposing and striking appearance. Their mode of riding, dress, and accoutrements all went to prove that they were a war party of Arickaree braves. The work of slaughtering the buffaloes continued for more than an hour. Then the hunters commenced the work of skinning and cutting up the dead animals and placing the hides and meat on their horses and travois, a vehicle made from poles attached to a horse with one end dragging on the ground. And forming in a line, they moved up the valley in the direction of the main Arickaree village, which was situated about 10 or 12 miles farther up the river. The young Yankton brave cautiously followed them, and the interval between sundown and dark was spent by him in a thicket within view of their wigwams. How vivid were the scenes in their camp from his lowly post when twilight thickened into darkness. Campfires were seen blazing and smoldering here and there, with groups of warriors, some standing in the ruddy glare, while others were sitting and lying on the ground in shadowy relief. The hunters had returned, and preparations were being made for a grand feast. Overflowing kettles steamed from many a wigwam. The young Yankton rose and walked straight towards the village. It was the hour the hunters returned from the chase, preparatory to eating their evening meal. Young Strike the Ree, knowing the habits and customs of his enemies, was aware that on occasions of this kind, all those that were hungry, and in an Indian village at that season of the year, that meant many, were entitled to come to the lucky hunter's wigwam and partake of the refreshments. Having taken the precaution to paint and disguise himself like an Arickaree as much as possible, with steady mind and unfaltering steps, Strike the Ree mingled on the outskirts with the throng of his mortal enemies and entered the village in their company. To learn the position of Forebear's wigwam and to calmly demean himself while in this perilous crisis became the task of the cunning Yankton. When darkness completely shrouded all, he stealthily concealed himself in a narrow gap between two tents, screened from sight by some hides of newly killed buffalo thrown across poles to be cleaned in the morning. With his knife, the crafty Yankton brave cautiously cut a hole in the buffalo hide large enough to enable him to see all what passed within the wigwam of Forebears, and with teeth set, eyes fixed attentively upon the narrow aperture, and ears sensitively alive to every sound, he sat awaiting the eagerly desired opportunity for glutting his vengeance. Within the wigwam sat two children, while a squaw, still young and comely, stood by the fire preparing the evening meal. Presently, the covering at the entrance of the wigwam was raised, and the eyes of Strike the Ree glistened as he almost ceased to breathe, as he recognized the form of the slayer of his brother, Forebears. The famous warrior advanced to the fire, laid his blanket and implements of war aside, and seating himself without a word, intimated by a motion of his hand his readiness to partake of the evening meal. The squaw immediately brought forth various huge slices of the cooked meat from the kettle, and placing them before him, the humble creature retreated to a respectable distance from his side, and awaited his further pleasure. It was evident that for some cause the Arickaree chief was out of humor. Presently, the screen at the entrance was again raised, and several hungry Indians entered, seating themselves by the fire and helping themselves to the contents of the kettle, ate in silence. The meal concluded, they followed the example of the chief, filled their pipes with kinnikindick, and prepared to smoke. Meanwhile, the squaw occupied herself, unconscious of the fierce retributive vengeance at hand, in placing the two papooses in their accustomed places, in a bed made from the skins of wild animals, while the warriors smoked and in deep guttural tones talked to the failure of the war party in overtaking the Yankton braves' friends who were in the bullboat. It appears that the hunting party that was pursuing the buffalo during that day was a war party of 40 or 50 of the chief men of the band, headed by Forebears, who started in pursuit of the fugitives the night previous. But the occupants of the bullboat, having evaded them, and meeting with the large herd of buffalo coming into the Missouri from their native feeding grounds, they abandoned the pursuit of war for that of the chase. The warriors, after smoking, left the wigwam of the chief, who continued to smoke in silence. Raising his head from the contemplation of the scene in the wigwam of the chief, Strike the Ree listened attentively to the sounds that were gradually decreasing in the village. The voice of children was long since hushed. The warriors had all separated and betaken themselves to their lodges. All was silence without, and if a step or a whispered conference was heard, it was that of some Indian maiden whom a lover was wooing under cover of the night. Presently, even these sounds ceased, and the growls of the hungry dog over a bone was all that could be distinguished. The impatient watcher again contemplated the scenes within the young chief's lodges. The squaw laying down on a pile of buffalo robes beside her children, which served them for a bed, and Forebears was still sitting by the dying embers, taking his last whiff from his almost empty pipe. When it gave forth no more smoke, the chief laid it down and sought his couch. Up rose Strike the Ree, at first with the stealthy motion of a snake, and then, knowing well the custom of the tribe that allows a hungry man to enter any wigwam at all hours, he confidently stepped across the threshold and entered the lodge and commenced an onslaught of the remains of the kettle. Not a motion was made by the Arickaree, though his squaw whispered in tones that caught the ear of the young brave. "Who is that eating in our wigwam so late?" "My brother is hungry, no doubt," was the reply of the chief. His meal ended, Strike the Ree rose and stirred the embers of the fire, as if accidentally with his toe, by which maneuver he succeeded in gaining a look at the prostrate form of his foe. Grasping his spear, he thrust the fatal instrument of death through the back of the chief. Forebear goes to the happy hunting grounds where he sent the brother of Strike the Ree, hissed the Yankton brave, while hastily taking the scalp of his victim. The poor squaw lay speechless with terror, affording him time to take the chief's lance and bow, the scalp of his brother, with that of the unfortunate chief, who died at the first blow, and make his exit in safety. The squaw, infuriated by the sight of the dead chief, vainly strove to clutch the murderer, who, grasping his trophies of victory, rushed forth amid the mess of lodges, now alive with warriors, who came rushing out, startled at the fearful cries of the young squaw in the chief's lodge. Ere he gained the thicket on the outskirts of the village, the sound of his own name, re-echoed by 100 voices, caused him to hurry on at double speed. To be continued. Tune back in soon for part 5 of this incredible story. This story came from the great state of South Dakota, being reported in the Press and Daily Dakotaian of September 3rd, 1888. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.